The first thing to do when following the SPEcSLIMS method is to read the poem, and I recommend reading it a few different times. Once you've done that, you then need to identify the subject. And although the title says winter, I think it also is something that's figurative. It's not an actual winter. This is really about the winter within our hearts. In fact, it seems like it's the effect that this emotionally cold apathy has on our hearts. The next idea is to look at the purpose. And again, that requires having some understanding of the poem already. In this case, I think that purpose is perhaps to warn us that these experiences that make us emotionally cold linger on afterwards. And that really is put forth through these final lines where we learn that we must still be captives still. And the emotional response, well, certainly we're going to reflect on our own actions. Perhaps it's even one of evaluating ourselves, and that have we been like this? Have we been apathetic? And if so, do we then regret how we had acted? Now we go back and look at the craftsmanship. And the first thing we do is we look at the structure. There's clearly two stanzas, one of 8 lines and one of 6 lines. We also notice that most of these lines are end stop, but not all of them. There are 3 that are using enjambment, and we can see them here. Now, what do I notice about these uses of enjambment? Well, with these first 2, the descriptions are both about movement, and here literally the word moved is used, and in this one it's about following. So that enjambment increases the pace. Now, this last one isn't quite doing that. It's not speaking about movement. But remember, sometimes enjambment is effective in making surprising links between things. And that's where we see, that's how we see the enjambment used here. Because before, we'd been described as captives. But then in the next line, the speaker is asserting that we are actually taking on the qualities of winter. And I look overall at this, and there are some breaks. We see some moments of caesura, in this case here with winter is gone. And that's a declarative sentence, perhaps making us pause and think. And same here with I tell you no. Finally, as far as any sort of shifts go, there is the initial shift between stanzas. But there's also a shift here, and that's indicated by the word now. But there's also a shift here between what we expect spring to be like and what really happens. So after that, we want to look at the language and diction. And that's a little bit difficult here because there's so much figurative language which is used later. But I'll try to examine some specific word choices. So the first that I see is this word stumbling. And that's describing our feet, and that helps to characterize people in general as maybe clumsy or at least susceptible to being caught. Now after that, there are a few similes within the personification, but I want to focus on this word reluctantly. It's an interesting one because it implies that winter enjoys keeping us captive. And I believe that's reinforced with the use of that word soberly. While he kept us captive, it maybe was fun, but now he has to become serious again because he has to leave. Next, and this continues that pattern, is this idea of the last cool sigh. While a sigh may just be a description of the sound that's heard, here I think it is also implying that winter doesn't want to leave. The next pieces of strong diction are actually deeply embedded within the figurative language, so I'm going to examine them that way. The first piece of figurative language we see is the direct personification of winter. And we can see that directly in the first line, but also in the rest of the descriptions. And within those descriptions, we see the strong metaphor, held us long in iron chains of cold. And there are a few interesting words there. So first, the idea is that he held us long, which means that he's strong enough to do so. Iron is a strong metal, and so these bonds are very powerful as well. The speaker uses the term chains, which of course are meant to keep things captive. And then the comparison of the literal and the figurative is made clear that these aren't actual iron chains. It's actually just the cold. A little bit later, there's another metaphor which helps to reinforce this idea of captivity. But what's interesting about this is that it develops the idea, whereas iron chains perhaps would be used on human prisoners, snares are meant for animals. And perhaps this is somehow implying that winter is just that much more powerful, or that we become like animals. What I also like is that description of sharp, that not only have these things caught us, but they're actually painful and perhaps even leave a figurative mark. The next is that simile there where winter, leaving through the personification, is actually described like a dream. Which may seem strange because hopefully dreams are positive things, but I don't think they're trying to, the speaker is trying to transfer that connotation. What she's really doing is that she's saying, similar to a dream in the idea that we're not even sure whether it was here or what exactly happened. It's somehow inexplicable. The next pieces of figurative language are actually two symbols. We see the marsh hawk and the crow. You might know about the crow, or at least know what it looks like, but often the crow is used to symbolize death. In fact, some cultures believe that the crow carries someone's soul from living to the underworld. Now, a hawk is something that's predatory, which is interesting because that if he's associated with winter, then there's this predatory quality to winter, which is reinforcing the idea of the sharp snares. But also a marsh is a swamp, so it's something that's rotten. And so while marsh hawks may be beautiful birds, swamps themselves are areas of decay, and that's what's being associated. Now we move on to the personification of spring. And there's a few different things that I notice here. First is that spring is able to heal wounds, which relates directly to those sharp snares, but also breathe freedom and throw all her singing into the air. Breathing freedom is interesting because breathing is something effortless. And that implies that spring perhaps isn't trying to heal these wounds and bringing and liberating everyone, but that it's just something natural that spring does. She's a nurturer. Also, with this description of throw all her singing on the barren air, obviously she can't throw the sound, of course. That's an example of synesthesia. But the singing is associated with joy, and of course that contrasts with the idea of barren. But what's interesting is that she throws it, and whereas breathing implied that it was effortless, throwing it just implies that it's not purposeful. Then finally, in those final three lines, we see that strong word of captive still, which goes back to this relationship he's established with Winter. But then the qualities of Winter have been transformed to the people. What we're seeing is that these qualities of being powerful and oppressive and trying to catch us and hurt us and being related with decay and death now have transferred to the people. So those feelings have become internal, and because it's about watch each other and touch each other and speak, these are interactive descriptions. So not only are these ideas internal, but we interact with other people with these. Next, I want to look at movement, I accidentally already looked a little bit at movement when we looked at structure. The pace tends to be rather even except for those enjambed lines or where we pause for the caesuras, but also the movement as far as ideas are concerned. And it'll help if rather than just highlighting everything the same color, I try to highlight the patterns. So most of this is all about the effects of winter or the descriptions of winter, except for the things I highlighted down here. So I'm going to change the color. And what that helps me realize is that the pattern goes from a detailed description of what winter does, its effects, and then this potential hope, and then back to the despair that we see down here. Finally, I want to look at the sounds, and certainly within the fourth line, we see quite a bit of sibilance, this sound here. And while sibilance can create a calming mood, here because of the context, I think it's rather sinister. The other interesting sounds that I noticed, because of course there's no rhyme scheme here, is the direct alliteration. Now, what does that cause us to do? I think it helps if you actually say the words out loud, bitter breath. And this affects the tone, I think, of the speaker. It reveals the tone. It's almost as if the speaker is spitting out these words. So it's not just this mood of despair here, but the speaker is really condemning it. He's angry with it. So of course, now I look back and try to understand, is the purpose that I identified before reinforced through the craftsmanship, through the stylistic devices? So I go back to my theme. Experiences like loss or suffering linger on and influence how we interact with other people. In that case, I realized that winter, it doesn't actually mean the season, it's a figurative winter. It's that we are emotionally cold, the winter of our hearts.